We have seen last time that literature is the topic of Deleuze's first essay, where he presents literature as a point of encounter between two powers, two ways of thinking, which are science and myth. The reality of the desert island is not found in science only, Deleuze says, or in mythology only, but in the encounter between the two, which forms a second repetition that allows us to grasp the reality of the desert island. As it turns out, literature is also the topic of the very last book published during Deleuze's lifetime, called Essays Critical and Clinical. The goal of these later texts is essentially the same as Desert Island, to show how literature can allow us to grasp being, or reality. However, Deleuze now insists on the vital aspect of writing, and shows the relation between the becoming revolutionary of literature and its capacity to create visions and auditions that are not of language, but which language alone makes possible, as he says. What does revolution have to do with language and with writing? As we will see, the revolution that he has in mind operates in a space of madness, but one which is at the micro level, below the usual level of consciousness, in the thoughtless banality of daily life. And in spite of its discrete nature, this type of revolution, conducted primarily against the self and the signifier, is the most powerful type of revolution that we can operate. So in this video, we are going to examine what Deleuze has to say about the power of ordinary madness that is contained in literature. There is no doubt that literature occupies a central place in Deleuze's philosophy, but it is perhaps less because of the medium itself than what it can do. Indeed, Deleuze says, to those who ask what literature in the sense of the act of writing, which is called l'écriture in French, is, Virginia Woolf responds, to whom are you speaking of writing? The writer does not speak about it, but is concerned with something else. That something else is the vital problem that an author encounters, as opposed to personal issues, my personal story. It's about a manifestation of life itself, which is directly opposed to a personalistic literature that focuses on the self and which kills life. To write, Deleuze explains, is certainly not to impose a form of expression on the matter of lived experience. Writing is a question of becoming, always incomplete, always in the midst of being formed, and goes beyond the matter of any livable or lived experience. It is a process that is a passage of life that traverses both the livable and the lived. So to write is about becoming, about change and the passage of life. But what does that mean? One of Deleuze and Guattari's favorite author, Kafka, expresses this best. To write is about transformation. It's not about establishing great themes that are somehow related, but it's about being changed by the relations we are in, or we find ourselves in writing. This Deleuze and Guattari famously call becoming woman, or animal, or vegetable, or molecule. Becoming means becoming ever smaller, to the point of becoming imperceptible, which is the goal of the process. These becomings may be linked to each other by a particular line, Deleuze says, suggesting that writing begins at the macro level and ends or culminates through a process of regression at the micro level. The first step, becoming woman, is not obviously about gender, for even authors who are women must learn to become women. Rather, it's about rejecting stereotypes, formalizations, methods, received ideas or dominant ideas, the thousand clichés that already inhabit the blank page. One does not become man insofar as man presents himself as a dominant form of expression that claims to impose itself on all matter, whereas woman, animal, or molecule always has a component of flight that escapes its own formalization. In psychological terms, writing begins with the negation of any imperative, such as the idea that I have to write if I'm an author. Rather, it's about offering no resistance to the affects that present themselves as we write or as we engage in the process of writing, so as to avoid pre-established forms. Of all the pre-established forms that are to be avoided, there is good old me, the self, the author. The author's block intervenes in particular when one feels the compulsion rather than the need to write. That's why writing, like becoming, is fundamentally impersonal, not just at a subjective level, but also at a grammatical level. Becoming is always between or among, a woman between women, or an animal among others. But the power of the indefinite article is effected only if the term, in becoming, is stripped of the formal characteristics that make it say the animal in front of you. Impersonality is not a natural state for us, and Deleuze suggests that it requires a form of habituation, like an initiation ritual perhaps, one which, like all habits, begins in the body. All writing involves an athleticism, But far from reconciling literature with sports or turning writing into an Olympic event, this athleticism is exercised in flight and in the breakdown of the organic body. An athlete in bed, as Michaud put it. To the extent that literature involves dying to oneself, it is about becoming animal, the second moment of becoming. One becomes animal all the more when the animal dies. And contrary to the spiritualist prejudice, it is the animal who knows how to die, who has a sense or premonition of death. Literature begins with a porcupine's death, according to Lawrence, or with the death of a mole in Kafka, our poor little red feet outstretched for tender sympathy. As Moritz said, one writes for dying calves. Deleuze suggests that as this process of miniaturization, this regression to the micro-level continues, we may become able to heal from our past traumatic experiences, precisely because we become impersonal. As a general rule, fantasies simply treat the indefinite as a mask for a personal or a possessive. A child is being beaten is quickly transformed into my father beat me. But literature takes the opposite path and exists only when it discovers beneath appearing persons the power of an impersonal, which is not generality, but singularity at the highest point, a man, a woman, a beast, a stomach, a child. This cathartic power of the impersonal is the place of fabulation, that is, the place where the third eye, the eye of the mind, provides new vision. There is no literature without fabulation, but as Bergson was able to see, fabulation, the fabulating function, does not consist in imagining or projecting an ego. Rather, it attains these visions, it raises itself to these becomings and powers. A vision that is too powerful for us, an affect that transcends us. This opens up to a very strange theme in Deleuze, one which is found everywhere in his writings, namely madness. Madness seems quite natural to fabulation. We need a little bit of madness to perceive and to speak out. But it is also true that the regression to the micro level is not without danger. Madness is a dangerous thing, after all. It definitely is one of the risks that we encounter in literature. Literature, like language, is destined to struggle with madness, which in the context of writing Deleuze ascribes to the problem of style. In text number 57 of Two Regimes of Madness, Deleuze writes, "Stretched to its internal limit, toward this outside of language, language begins to stutter, to stammer, to scream, and to whisper. Again, but in another way, style appears as non-style and constitutes the madness of language, its delirium. Madness is the vector of creation, but it can also become a vector of destruction. When we encounter an affect that is too powerful for us, something too great for us, we can be dissolved in the cosmos. We may never be able to come back from the experience. We know from our previous studies, notably logic of sense, that there are two poles of madness, one which is above and the other below, neurosis and psychosis, one which fixates the movement in a unique image, a unique principle, and the other which is undifferentiated, like an abyss. These two forms of madness work very differently, but as far as literature is concerned, they have the same effect. Neuroses and psychoses, Deleuze says, are not passages of life, but states into which we fall when the process is interrupted, blocked, or plugged up. Illness is not a process, but a stopping of the process. This was the case notoriously for Nietzsche. The infinite semiosis of psychosis, the absolute fixation of neurosis. In logic of sense, if you recall, conscience appears as a surface of contact between these two extremes, and this surface can always be pierced, such that we may fall on one side or the other. Literature is the art of remaining in a balance between these two poles. It's about learning how to navigate between disturbed waters. It's a very dangerous activity, and as Deleuze dramatically says, the writer returns from what he has seen and heard with bloodshot eyes and pierced eardrums. We see too much and we hear too much. So why even try? Why undergo a process which will likely leave us half dead? Why even engage with life itself? Well, the answer is that what constitutes the biggest danger for us is also what constitutes our greatest hope. Literature is how we constitute new subjectivities. It's how we reconstitute the self, but not as me, rather as a multiplicity. Deleuze calls this inventing a people. Health as literature, as writing, consists in inventing a people who are missing. It is the task of the fabulating function to invent a people. Of all the literatures in the world, there is one that has managed to do so with great success, to reach this strange universal and singular point, and it is American literature. American literature has an exceptional power to produce writers who can recount their own memories, but as those of a universal people composed of immigrants from all countries. It is the greatness of America and of American culture to always be able to reinvent itself, even in the midst of tremendous difficulties, to produce eyes and ears for this greater form of art. And if it has this singular power, it is precisely because of an instinct for freedom as opposed to a power of centralization or domination. This is not exactly a people called upon to dominate the world, it is a minor people, eternally minor, taken up in a becoming revolutionary. If freedom has meaning in Deleuzean philosophy, it may well be related to this ability to meet the event, to become revolutionary, which is found in American literature, in the ordinary and discreet madness of banal characters. For example, in text number 10 of the Essays, Deleuze discusses Melville's famous line, which he puts in Bartleby's mouth: "I would prefer not to." It is one of the rare occurrences where Deleuze actually writes in English. In itself, the formula seems almost wrong grammatically. It creates a tension in language, like a type of nonsense that confronts the reader with a problem. So this formula digs in language a foreign language, as Deleuze often says, because it creates a zone of indistinction, a pure affect, a problem. I would prefer not to. With this formula, Bartleby has won the right to survive, that is, to remain immobile and upright before a blind wall. He has earned the right to not respond to a request. He has earned the right to stay silent, and he has done so by challenging language itself. He is urged to say yes or no, but if he said no to collating or running errands, or if he said yes to copying, he would quickly be defeated and judged useless, and would not survive. Bartleby's formula thus realizes the destiny of literature, which is to reach this revolutionary madness, however discreetly, that responds with silence to the powers that be. If it is true that the masterpieces of literature always form a kind of foreign language within the language in which they are written, what wind of madness, what psychotic breath thereby passes into language as a whole? Psychosis characteristically brings into play a procedure that treats an ordinary language, a standard language, in a manner that makes it render an original and unknown language, which would perhaps be a projection of God's language, and would carry off language as a whole. Is this not the schizophrenic vocation of American literature, to make the English language, by means of driftings, deviations, detaxes or surtaxes, as opposed to the standard syntax, slip in this manner, to introduce a bit of psychosis into English neurosis, to invent a new universality? Of course, this new universality is not meant to control others. On the contrary, it's meant to liberate the people, this people which does not yet exist, through the means of a discreet and ordinary revolution that allows us to maintain the world at a distance for a while, a pure actuality of being which escapes the control of society by becoming completely transparent. I would prefer not to. There is always a risk for us to fall back into larval fascism, as Deleuze says, that is, to become what we used to hate, to try and control life and others and even ourselves. But true freedom is not an ideology. It's not about control, but rather it's a concrete practice. The practice by which we go from the macro level of clichés and stereotypes and the self to the level of micro-perceptions. It is in literature that becoming other can in fact become such a practice. The creation of words or neologisms is worth nothing apart from the effects of syntax in which they are developed. So literature already presents two aspects. Through the creation of syntax, it brings about not only a decomposition or destruction of the maternal language, but also the invention of a new language within language. It is true that things can go very wrong. Too much rigidity or too much fluidity leads us to bloodshot eyes and pierced eardrums, to psychosis or neurosis, to an interruption of the creative process. All the authors that Deleuze loves and mentions, from Lawrence to Faulkner to Kerouac, Fitzgerald, Burroughs, and many others, are those who were able to find a balance in the tumultuous world of micro-sensations, and to say no to the stereotypes, to the control, to the macro-clichés. Revolution is ultimately about putting a stop to the infinite cycles of repetition that we impose more or less voluntarily on ourselves. It's about freedom in the smallest of things, namely freedom in perception, the freedom to see and hear what's between the words and beyond the self. A foreign language cannot be hollowed out in one language without language as a whole, in turn, being toppled or pushed to a limit, to an outside or reverse side that consists of visions and auditions that no longer belong to any language. These visions are not fantasies, but veritable ideas that the writer sees and hears in the interstices of language in its intervals. They are not interruptions of the process, but breaks that form part of it, like an eternity that can only be revealed in a becoming, or a landscape that only appears in movement. They are not outside language, but the outside of language. The writer as seer and hearer, the aim of literature. It is the passage of life within language that constitutes ideas. These are just a few examples of how Deleuze relates madness to literature and finds the becoming revolutionary of ordinary madness. In so doing, Deleuze pursues one of Nietzsche's central themes, which is creation. The main point, I believe, is that the importance of art does not reside in its abstract value, in the fact that it allows us to escape reality for a while, or in its public success. It's not about dopamine hits. On the contrary, it is reality itself that is already artistic, and we naturalize ourselves, so to speak, in the act of creation, however small. In this sense, creation as a practice becomes an ontological category which precedes abstract material reality or subjective experience, and makes them possible in the first place. Far from nihilism or pessimism, it's a window to perhaps one of the most profound metaphysics ever seen in philosophy. As usual, I'd like to address a special thank you to my patrons for their support to this channel. It is immensely appreciated. And for now, thank you all for watching, and see you soon.